Pleasure to meet you. Your book is over my shoulder.
I can see that. That's the newer edition. That's the paperback edition. Uh, University of Chicago Press, when the book came out in 1983,
Mm,
decided that they would only put it out in hardback. And that was a mistake because, the audience that they were hoping to reach were, young people, gamers who were not going to pay the price of a hardback. I think back then it was probably $30. Today, that's the price of a paperback. But, they so they didn't do anything until this came out, which was maybe 2003 or something like that. I don't remember the date, but it was 15, 20 years ago that the paperback came out. And at any rate, it is good talking with you. And
Same to you. Yeah, I only came across your book over the last 12 to 18 months while I've been researching my own book.
mhm, yeah.
And as I read it, I became increasingly worried by how many things you spotted all those years ago that I thought I was finding out for the first time.
Well,
Um,
I had done ethnographic research with Little League baseball players
mm,
before this. And so this was sort of an extension of that project. And, so I had spent time with young people. These were somewhat older than the Little League players who were 10 to 12 years old.
mm.
These were mostly adolescents, early adults when I was doing the research. Uh, but it was a continuation of that project because in my orientation, my scholarly field is to look at small group cultures. So I was looking at Little League baseball teams, which are groups of uh, 10 to 12 or 15 boys, typically boys. There are a few girls in the program. Um, but with Little League, they would meet maybe twice a week or three times a week for 2 hours, and they'd be mostly playing baseball. So they were not talking about the culture, the pre-adolescent culture, which was what I was primarily interested in. So I was looking for a site in which the culture would be more substantial, would be richer. And, I was having dinner with a colleague of mine whose son had just started playing Dungeons and Dragons or started playing fantasy role-playing games. And so the son was telling me about it, and I said to myself, this looks like a really fascinating place to continue that research. And, I attended some meetings. He introduced me to some people. And so for a period of about 2 years, from 1977 to 1979, I was immersed immersed in this project, and then eventually published the first edition in 1983.
You were very early on the scene. Um, and
Yes.
it's obviously it's an academic work, but it's also not one that I think has been superseded in the intervening years. As I've read it, things appeared novel to me, even though it was from all those years ago. And
Yeah.
I had lots of one of the things that interested me as well was you come from you're a sociologist. I'm a psychologist. I tend to focus on the individual. You tend to focus
Right.
on the group. But you picked up on all sorts of interesting individual level cognitive phenomena like frame switching. So trying to avoid leakage of the player's real world information or rules
That's
into
right.
their character's actions. Um,
Well, you see, I was a student of Irving Goffman, who is a prominent American or Canadian sociologist. Maybe the most important North American sociologist of the 20th century. So I was as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, I was his research assistant. I took a number of courses with him. And so, he was 1974, wrote a book called Frame Analysis. And so that idea of the frames was something that was very potent in my mind. Uh,
Yeah. It really struck me the depth in which you went into that. And it was so I had a couple of questions for you that were specific in a sense to my book, but also just a couple of curiosity-driven questions.
okay.
And of course, if anything if there's anything you want to add, please feel free to do so. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to do so. First one being, um, were you changed as a result of the experience between 1977 and 1979? Because you hadn't done anything apart from a little bit of wargaming previously,
Right.
according to your book.
Right.
So, on a personal level, obviously on an academic level, you will have learned something, and I want to ask you that as well. What you think you learned that
Yes.
you wouldn't otherwise have known? But on a personal level, you spent a lot of time with a group of people that you otherwise wouldn't have, presumably.
Hmm.
And if that had an impact on you personally, if that's not, well, it is a personal question, so it might be too personal.
Yeah. And it's a difficult question. And thinking back, we're talking about almost 50 years, 49 years when I started. Um, I mean, various things were happening in my life.
Hmm.
At this period, at the time I was doing this research, I was not a parent. Uh, I obviously had been an adolescent, uh, 10 years before. Uh, but, being part of this primarily all male group, not entirely all male, but predominantly a group of largely teenagers, high school students, um, certainly exposed me to uh, teen culture as it existed in Minnesota in the 1970s. Minnesota was a very different place than it is today. If read about all the various activities, political activities there. Um, Back in the 70s, Minnesota was very white, very Scandinavian and German. Um, and the populations of the Minneapolis St. Paul were probably 80% white and 5% Hispanic, 5% Black, 5% Native American. Very few international people in Minnesota. It was too cold. It was um, but you know for a variety of reasons Minnesota has changed over the course of particularly the past 30 years. Um, so, um, you know, I, I guess, I mean, it sort of prepared me eventually to be uh, a father of teenagers. I can't say that, I can't think of anything that, suddenly I was changed, I had been uh, a Democrat and I became a Republican, or I was gay and I became straight. I can't think of anything big in an identity way, but certainly being exposed to different cultures. I guess one thing is in doing this research, I read a lot of science fiction and a lot of fantasy, which I hadn't read before. I mean, there were days when I was writing the book, where, that day I would read a science fiction novel. Um, and so I read a lot of the award-winning novels and some non-award-winning novels, during that period, from 1977 to 1983 when the book came out.
And am I right in thinking you became, as a result of your research, you became increasingly convinced that what you were dealing with there, what you were observing was a subculture, um, in the terms in which you defined it. Um,
Right.
and you explain how, for example, one of the aspects of a subculture is that other people need to view it as a subculture, and that reinforces the connections between those people within it.
Yes.
What did you see as because one of the things that really interests me is the earliest period before you could really pick many games off the shelves and people were
Mhm.
fumbling around a bit in the dark with this new genre that had only just been invented effectively or discovered, depending on your point of view, around 1974. What do you think differentiated those people that you met from people who were not gaming in that period of time? Now, part of the answer to that might be obvious, but I don't want to pretend that all of it
Right.
is.
Well, I mean, some of it has to do with how they were recruited or how they became socialized. Uh, that the students that I was meeting, and at when I started, the primary group of participants were people who were either in high school or had just gotten out of high school. They would be people ages, let's say, 15 to 22 or 23, maybe just in college or just out of college. Uh, Eventually, Dungeons and Dragons became more appealing to younger children, and in some sense became maybe more appealing to older adults as they aged out of what they had been involved in, and at a certain point, it became very a lot of this activity went online. So now people talk about old school Dungeon and Dragons or old school fantasy gaming. It was all old school. That was the school. Um, you know, the in There was a lot of joking that would go on about these kids, and again, mostly boys, being nerds. Having limited social skills, by which it meant that they weren't hanging out with girls. They weren't dating. So I think I mentioned in the book that this major gaming group that I was part of met on Friday nights. And so, there was a lot of teasing that we're doing this on Friday nights rather than going to school parties or going to dances or movies with our girlfriends and so forth. That these were kids who saw themselves in many cases somewhat proudly as being set apart from, if we can call, a normal teenage culture. Uh, Girls, cars, alcohol, and so forth.
It's a very difficult question. I think it's a very difficult question. You spend a lot of time playing Traveller, so science fiction
That's right.
settings, and but obviously the main setting or the dyed in the wall RPG setting is Tolkien-esque fantasy, orcs, elves, etc., that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Um, so I'm trying to explain as part of one of the things I'm trying to explain in my book is why it is people don't role play more in real life contemporary settings, which fascinates me because we
Yeah.
have plenty of films, theater, where you don't need orcs, dragons, and spaceships to make a story interesting. But with role-playing games, it's highly unusual. It does exist, but it's highly unusual. And one
Right.
of my ideas is that people might feel a bit more let off the leash, morally speaking, when there are fairly simple, straightforward, categorical distinctions between good and evil. So an orc is bad,
Mhm.
you can therefore kill the orc, you don't need to think. That kind of thing,
Right.
for example. And I'm not sure if that's entirely the same for science fiction, but I didn't, and this is a very long preamble, I apologize. I I did note in your book that you mentioned there were quite a few things that people did in game that were unpleasant.
Right. Or which for them were fun, but they were set apart from reality. If that there was that membrane, that you could do things, that these male adventurers could do things in taverns with barmaids that, you know, they wouldn't think of doing in the real world. And I mean, in part because they were nerds and didn't have girlfriends and so forth. But it was their fantasies at work. And, you know, I, I mean, I think to have a fantasy game, you need to have a fantasy world. I mean, it can be a fantasy world set in the present, but it can't be set in urban Minneapolis. It can be set in China or in you know South Africa or wherever it might be. But there needs to be that distance so that what you're doing doesn't directly reflect on who you are.
Yes.
You're playing a character rather than, you know, ostensibly playing yourself.
Agreed. So it's that sense of psychological distance. My character can do these things and they won't reflect terribly on me because that's the
Right.
nature of the world and the fantasy that we are entertaining in this
Yes.
moment in time. Yes, that makes good sense to me. Was there any difference, and this is the hard question, which I wanted to start with, between fantasy and science fiction in that regard, or did you observe similar kinds of behavior in both kinds of settings? Was that something that struck you at the time, or did it not seem obvious?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of similarity because these were both other worlds in which all kinds of things are possible. They differed in terms of the type of adventures. In the Dungeon and Dragons type game, which in my case was mostly chivalry and sorcery, which was the most popular game in the communities that I studied, although some people did play Dungeons and Dragons. You're going into a dungeon and you're fighting dragons. In science fiction, you are looking at other kinds of worlds, but typically you are also fighting against um, whatever space creatures that have designs on you that want to kill you, and that there are opportunities for success, for treasure, and so forth. Um, so there were those differences. There were some players who were more who came out of the Tolkien-esque universe, those kind of medieval type fantasies, and others who came in through science fiction reading. But there was a lot of overlap. There would be, some weeks people would play Traveler, some weeks they would play Chivalry and Sorcery.
Did you witness much in the sense of co social cohesion within the groups? And again, I appreciate this was a long time ago, but in a sense that actually helps the question. Um, that gamers would reflect upon previous games and previous scenes within games as a sort of social glue that would so do you remember the time when you and I did this at this other
Oh,
game and this
sure.
funny thing happened? Um, the thing that interests me is so we agree that that occurs and that maybe that's a social
Mhm.
bonding that can occur during the game. But one of the things
Right.
that strikes me is we often think of RPGs in terms of story. And by story, what people
Yes.
often understand is plot. So there's something overarching going on, and scenes are just part of this overarching plot, which maybe a games master has inserted or designed or tried to weave into their games. But I wonder if actually the things that you might remember or the things that I remember are scenes and not the overarching plot in any way, shape, or form. It's moments within games. Is that your experience?
Well, I think that's right, and I think that partly related to the game master or the dungeon master or the referee. The people that was studying were not, you know, in for the most part, they did not have this overarching sensibility. It was I'm going to roll dice. My players will make some decisions. I'll roll dice and we will see what happens. They may have had maps of dungeons and so forth, but they didn't have this plan for what is going to happen. Um, the exception to that, which is an interesting and controversial exception, is Empire of the Petal Throne, which is a somewhat different issue, but we could go off and talk about that and about M.A.R. Barker and Tecumseh and that he he discovered a lot of things about him subsequently, but at the time he was kind of a Tolkien figure, right? He was a linguist. He taught linguistics, South Asian linguistics at the University of Minnesota, like Tolkien, who was teaching, uh, old linguistics at, uh, I,
Oxford, I
I can't
think.
remember if Cambridge or
Oxford, I
at
think. Yeah.
Cambridge,
Oxford, I think.
Oxford. Okay. Um, and so they were both scholars who were very much into detail rather than into theory,
Mm.
linguistic theory. Um, but they both created these imaginary worlds, and so they could insert the players. I was one of them. There are others, um, who were engaging in their world, who were doing things like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and so forth. Those kind of adventures that they were more organizing than most of the referees who were just dealing with moment to moment decisions of the players by rolling dice and in some cases changing the dice rolls or re-rolling dice if the dice rolls were not the kind of responses that their players wanted.
Yeah, and it struck me when I read your book, you had a sample size of two in those days of Tolkien and Barker in terms of world builders of that scope and
Right.
detail. I spoke to Ed Greenwood a couple of months ago. He's the designer of the founder of the Forgotten Realms, probably the most popular setting within Dungeons and Dragons since the 1980s. And it
Mhm.
struck me that one of the observations you made in your book that both of these people, Tolkien and Barker, had started building their fantasy worlds very, very young. If I
Mhm.
remember correctly, Ed Greenwood was definitely before he was 10. I think he was when he was 7. He
Yeah.
started designing the Forgotten Realms. And it's interesting this commonality between these people. And none of them began thinking about their world as a game world. They
Right.
all, Tolkien never, presumably, but with the exception of the Middle-earth role-playing game over my shoulder, I don't think that was his work. But they all began just because they were desperate to create a world or
Yes.
felt drawn to it. And I find that incredibly interesting. We won't go into yeah, I've read some things on M.A.R. Barker's Wikipedia page. I don't remember the details, but I don't remember them being particularly pleasant. Um,
Right. I
and
mean, he was a very pleasant man,
mm,
that you uh I in playing the games, I would never have imagined this underside of him, other than the fact, I mean, I shouldn't say other than the fact, but this man from Idaho, if I recall correctly, uh, you know, becomes interested in Islam,
mm,
becomes Ahmed Barker, and does his work in, I believe it's Pakistan. So that's a, a little bit strange. I always thought that was strange, but he was always very kind to me and very kind to the other players who were, this mix of white Americans, some Jewish, some not. Um, but he was always a very good, kind host.
mm. And presumably things like changes of religion are relatively benign, aren't they? Well, they are benign,
Well,
even if
back then it
unusual.
would be unusual.
Yes.
I mean, we all thought it was unusual that here is this guy from Idaho who decides that he wants to be Muslim.
Mm,
Okay, I mean, it seemed like a curiosity, but then there were so many curiosities about him in terms of creating this world, of Tekamel, the Empire of the Petal Throne.
Yeah. It's probably worth saying at this point. So my understanding is he became a Holocaust denier later in life and a few other things besides wrote some books which weren't particularly which were a bit
Right. I mean,
racially motivated.
I don't know when, when he had his, you know, whether he changed his politics or whether the politics were there all along. I don't know that.
Understood.
Uh, I will say that I was do work on sociology of reputations. And so at one point I was writing this article about Holocaust denial. Um, and I would get this magazine, small journal uh, of this group, uh, Institute for Historical uh, Reevaluation or something. I don't remember the exact title. And I saw on the masthead a man named Phil Barker.
Mm.
And I said, "Oh, that's kind of odd." I didn't think all that much about it, but I did say, "Oh, I knew a Phil Barker," and I still don't know if it's the same Phil Barker because there are plenty of Phil Barkers in the world, but
It's funny. I don't know if you met Mike Mornard when you were playing in M.A.R. Barker's Tecmo, because I had an interview with him a few months ago. He's famous in RPG history circles because he played in Gary Gygax's Greyhawk, in Dave Arneson's Blackmore, and in M.A.R. Barker's Tecmo,
okay.
all in this period. So if someone's met M.A.R. Barker and played in Tecmo, I wonder if they've also met Mike Mornard, who seems to have met everyone. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
Uh, the name is not familiar, but uh, I, with one exception, I don't remember the names of people. I could go back into my field notes and maybe he's there, but I don't know.
No, no problem. So the question I asked you at the beginning was, and then I just asked another one too quickly afterwards, was what you felt that, what was your takeaway, the thing that you learned sociologically speaking, after having completed your study of these RPG gamers in Minnesota in the late 70s?
Right. Well, what I was interested in was the creation of a group culture and the fact that fantasies are never simply fantasies, that they are tied to a social reality. So that the world that these boys are creating is a world that reflects the world that they live in with particular kinds of transformations. So it is a world that includes gender, that includes social class, that includes economics, that even in some cases includes race, that, that fantasies are not simply uh, fantasies. They're not simply from the thin air, that they reflect the world in which people are living. And, so I saw that as sort of being a grounding of this study. And then as a sociologist, I'm looking at the way that groups create these meanings, create these cultures, um, and that how these boys and men uh, create a culture that they can refer back to. So we talked about the episodes, and they did remember things that happened the previous week or several months ago if they were traumatic enough. And then I'm looking at the frames, which we talked a little bit about, and what I talked about, the three levels of framing, so that, there's the game itself, and things happen in the game. Dragons get killed. That orcs get killed, treasures are found, people meet with non-player characters, they interact in taverns and so forth. So there's that world, and then there's the world of players, the people around the table. So it's not just their character, but it's John or Michael who is playing a lawfully evil character, a chaotic good character, a character with particular kinds of stra strengths and traits. Maybe a strong character or a wise character. Um, and as players, they are doing that. And so they're thought of as someone who is in the game. But they're also, on the third level, they're also people. They're teenagers, they're boys. They live in 1970s Minnesota. And so they are part of that culture. They are living through Jimmy Carter's presidency, the economics of the period, the stagflation and so forth. And they are living with parents, those who don't have cars. So the parents have to come and pick them up, or, they have to take public transportation or whatever the case may be. So those are the three levels and looking at the three frames and how they intersect.
Yeah, and psychologically speaking, it's actually quite hard to shift between frames quite frequently. And you give some examples, some
Mhm.
quotes as well in the book of people switching, well, mixing frames actually, even
Right,
within sentences sometimes.
right.
Um,
I mean, there was at that period, slightly after my research, this concern about uh, the players committing suicide. Well, the argument was that they are so invested in their character that in those instances in which the character dies, that happened quite infrequently in my experience. If a character died, there was always some way of reviving them because you don't want to lose that player. But for those whose character died, it was claimed. Uh, the group was called Bad, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. Um, that in the game, it's psychologically dangerous because your character can die, and that means that you have no reason to live.
I remember
And
Gary Gygax's retort to that, saying, "Well, you can't spend the gold pieces that you win in the game, so in the real world, and we shouldn't treat adults as if they can't handle something like understanding that their character is not actually themselves."
well, the argument that I made, and this was in another article published, I think, in 1991, was that you know, okay, they pointed, I think, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons at one point, it pointed to 70 suicides. The suicides are always multiply determined. It's not just one thing, but they pointed, I think it was about 70. And the point I made is how many suicides were prevented? You now have a group of friends, you have people who care about you, you have occasions, you might be isolated in your bedroom and now you can go out and you're hanging out with friends. How many suicides would there have been if there hadn't been Dungeons and Dragons? We can never know because those are people who are still alive.
Mm.
So, okay, it's maybe let's take for granted that 70 is the right number. I think it's far fewer than that personally, but let's say it's 70. Maybe there are 700 uh, kids who would have committed suicide, but we will never know about any of them.
There are even studies now showing that, well, not showing, there are interventions, RPG interventions being designed and implemented to help people with loneliness, or to help autistic people who might otherwise have relative
Right.
difficulty with free conversation. Having the turn taking is particularly helpful, perhaps, for autistic
Yeah.
individuals. So it's now being flipped a bit
Hmm.
on its head. I mean, as you say, it's really hard to prove an absence of a suicide was due to
That's
something
right.
else. Um, but yeah, it was you were definitely working at the time where society was trying to work out what RPGs meant. I suppose
Hmm.
for their children in particular, because
That's right. And there were conservative Christians who would look at the game and say, there you have these monsters and these demonic figures that could be part of the game, and that's anti-Christian. Um, and you can be, your character can be evil, chaotic evil. Do we really want that? That was a debate that was characteristic at the time. I suspect that you hear that somewhat less today.
Mm.
But and also when I'm doing this research, this is, people who are playing face to face. It's not until 1980, 1981 that, some students at MIT begin to develop these multi-level mass uh, computer games.
Yeah, and my interest and the book is specifically about tabletop role-playing games
Right,
because I think certainly from a psychological perspective, as soon as you remove the players from around the table and take them anywhere else, virtually or whatever, a lot changes,
right.
psychologically speaking. Um, okay, I only really had one more question
Oh,
for
and then
you.
there's, we haven't talked about LARPs, the live
No,
action role-playing
no.
games, which is not a domain that I have been engaged in, but it's kind of a remarkable development, particularly I believe in Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, it seems to be the center of the LARP universe.
Yeah, I was speaking to a Sarah Lynn Bowman. I know you've written a chapter in a book that she's written a chapter in as well. She's a game designer. I'm going to mispronounce this. A Swedish university called Uppsala, I believe.
Yes, Uppsala, yeah.
Uppsala.
Or
And
Uppsala. I'm never sure,
yeah,
how the Swedes prefer.
yeah, I have no idea myself. So apologies if I've done that wrong to anybody. Um, she's very interested in LARP. I feel like it's so psychologically different when for good reasons, people want to study LARP because it's embodied.
Mhm.
And one person I spoke to who wrote a book on Dungeons and Dragons as well said that he could never get past the embarrassment threshold of the idea of running around in a cape with a stick
Right.
in public spaces. I think there's a certain kind of person who I'm one of these, fortunately or unfortunately, who would probably never LARP. I don't think I could do it. I'm an academic TTRPG player.
Mhm.
I like to sit still and maybe put on a voice if I'm very lucky. But I'm sure that's very, very different, and that's relatively modern. I don't think people weren't doing that in the late 70s, early 80s,
Oh,
presumably.
no, 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 not then. The turn of the 21st century, it becomes more common. Um, and it is, I mean, what's interesting is the similarities and the differences and the way that you structure a rule-based order, without the kind of social control that you get in face-to-face interactions around a table.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you one more thing about the kind of fantasy as a reflection of the people who play in it. So it's been said, I think, that fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons fantasy in particular, is very much centered around killing and looting, especially in the early
Yeah,
version. You gain experience by
right,
gathering cash, treasure, and by defeating monsters or foes. I mean, you don't have to kill them to defeat them, but it's the standard way, isn't it?
right, right.
And the hero's journey, the general trope of the hero's journey is very strong in American fantasy, in Dungeons and Dragons, whereby someone overcomes all the odds to get the princess and live happily ever after and defeat evil and so on and so forth. It strikes me that we don't have many instances. I'm sure someone will say that we do. We don't have many instances of fantasies which maybe don't reflect American values, if that's a fair reflection, if it's fair to say that. I'm not going to say American values are therefore about aggression and looting, obviously not, but someone maybe from another culture might have very different things. And of course, Tekamel was based on Asian cultures, and M.A.R. Barker's interest in Asian
Mhm.
cultures maybe
Well,
reflects
and
that
then
too.
Tolkien is
The
kind of
British. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So is it your view that fantasy is really for want of a better term, the eye of the beholder? It's about who constructs it. It's very much a psychological construct of the person who is involved in creating it.
Well, that goes back to the original point that I was making, that fantasies are never free floating.
Mm.
They're always embedded in a larger culture. And so that larger culture specifies, what that fantasy is going to consist of. Now, there are certain human, general human desires and certain general male desires and certain general teen desires, that transcend a particular locality. So that teenagers, throughout the world are facing various things of coming into adult society, various challenges. Men are facing particular challenges, different location by location, but there are some things that are similar, whether we're talking about Botswana or China or the United States or Great Britain and so forth. Uh, so the argument is that fantasy is always tied to cultures, but cultures can be similar or different, depending on the specifics that we're talking about.
Is it fair to say, therefore, that the shared language of fantasy is actually very necessary for it to function within a given society? So if someone was to try a fantasy from another culture, a very different culture, they might not enjoy it very much or might even find it jarring. But if you take a couple of Americans or a couple of Brits and you give them this setting which they're familiar with and has the tropes and the categories and the prototypes that they expect, they feel at ease and comfortable and relatively into the idea of suspension of disbelief.
Well, I think that's right, but kind of right on the margins, because I'm not sure, how much of a difference there is. So that would be an open empirical question.
Hmm.
What would fantasy gaming be like in Japan,
Mm.
for instance, or uh, somewhere where there's a distinctive, quite distinctive cultural themes, but yet Japanese culture and American culture, different but similar in many ways.
Right. It's a very interesting question about the universals, the potential universals in
Yes.
fantasy.
Right.
Um,
And that's one of the things about online gaming.
hmm.
The Second Life and the other big games. Uh, you have people who participate from around the world. So they have become very global.
So a final question for you. It's an entirely personal, non-academic one. Um, when was the last time you played an RPG?
Oh, I guess it was probably early 90s.
Okay.
And, there was a period of time in which my younger son and his friends, he would have been, what, about 8 or 9, maybe 9 years old. Uh, and, they would gather together around our dining room table, and I would be their dungeon master. Uh, and so it wasn't teenagers. So I made it kind of simple for them, but that would have been the last time. I'm occasionally invited to various kinds of events or cons, and I'll go, but I won't be going as a player.
Understood. I don't play much myself either. I'm much more interested now in just understanding it rather than actually being
Mhm.
involved in. Um, Gary, it's been really interesting to talk to you. Absolute pleasure.